So first we're going to start with Peter Doshi, who has been featured in the New York Times recently, and so you probably have heard of him.
I guess my involvement in this area of access to clinical trial data does not go back that far. My life doesn't go that much further, but it is actually getting to be a very exciting area, and so I think that's part of the reason I was invited to speak on this topic, to sort of give you a sense of what's going on, the politics around this issue, and beyond just the United States, because there's a lot of action in Europe. So all of the drugs on the screen are probably familiar to everybody in the audience. Everybody has a story, everybody can remember the stories, they're all embroiled in controversy. The point I want to make about these and what they have in common is that there's a story about evidence behind every one of them. And there's a story about access to data behind every one of them. And there's a before we had the data and when the data became public aspect to these stories. So take, for example, I'm going to give you two of these. The rosiglitazone, the Avandia story, where this became a topic of major attention in 2007 when Steve Nissen and colleagues at the Cleveland Clinic published a meta-analysis of a whole bunch of trials showing that the drug was associated with an increased risk of heart attack. Right? And how did they do this, and why didn't we know before? Because these trials were all completed. Well, the answer is they got access to unpublished studies, studies that were completed but had not been published in the scientific literature. How did they get access to that data? They got access to it because in 2004, that's when a lawsuit, people might remember this, Elliot Spitzer's lawsuit against GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, over the issue of adolescents and suicides, specifically around paroxetine or Paxil. Part of the settlement, though, the consent order, ordered GSK to set up a clinical trial registry. And in that registry, not just for Paxil, but for all of its drugs, that registry would report synopsis details of every trial, not just the trials that were published. So Steve Nissen and colleagues were able to look at that as well as data that the FDA had made available through FOIA and put together a picture of what did all the evidence look like, not just with the published, but with the unpublished trials. Lo and behold, they found that the drug was associated with an increased risk of heart attack. Celebrex. This is not a story about an unpublished trial, but a story about a trial that was published. So people are doing what they're supposed to. And in the publication, does that have a pointer? Oh, if you can see it, I've highlighted the lines. In the publication, which is published in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, it described a trial that was 6 months long, and it looked at one of the primary outcomes, the main things that the trialists were interested in, they reported, was to see its safety profile. Was this drug safer than the competitors and the NSAIDs? And so they reported, as you can see in the conclusions, that the drug was safer, was associated with a lower incidence of symptomatic ulcers and ulcer complications. Right? So it's safer in the GI system. Right. This was the drug's claim to fame. Not that it had this great improved efficacy over its competitors, but it was safer. Then we found out that the trial had been completely misreported. It wasn't a 6-month trial, it was over a year. And when you looked at the drug versus its competitors at a year, that safety advantage is gone. But again, this is why the drug became a blockbuster. Because of the JAMA article, because of the impression of a safer drug. So what evolves in looking at these stories is an understanding that for every trial, you have all these participants, patients enroll in them, their data is recorded. Every patient, every blood pressure, every T cell count, right? They're all recorded. Those things are recorded on case report forms, and they go into these large filing systems, right? These are actually papers. Now they're becoming electronic. massive amount of information. You can fill dump trucks with this, right? Massive amounts of information. That's been transcribed into individual patient data sets, big databases, like think of it as a large spreadsheet. Then what gets written is a clinical study report. Clinical study report can run thousands of pages. What do we see in the public? What do other researchers see? What do Cochrane reviewers see? What do systematic reviewers see? They only see what's above the waterline. They see the publications, 10-page article, the JAMA publication, right? They see conference abstracts. If they look really hard, they can find descriptions of trials from conferences where they were presented. They don't see any of the data that's below the waterline, data for the very same trials. And then when a trial's unpublished, when there is no JAMA article, no New England Journal of Medicine article, they don't see any of it, despite the fact that all that data exists. So the world about access to data today is a debate growing about how much of that evidence iceberg should be disclosed. And so this is in the British Medical Journal recently, which asked the question, are clinical trial data shared sufficiently today? And the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association said, yes, they are. The status quo is acceptable, and if we follow all the rules, and we like to follow the law, we like to follow the regulation, that's acceptable. And we do share data with researchers, legitimate researchers doing legitimate research. So what's the problem? Ben Goldacre, who is now, I think, best-selling author of this, first started with this book, Bad Science, and then went on to a more recent book just late last year, I think this year in the United States, called Bad Pharma, lays out the case for why missing data, this hidden data, is really one of the most fundamental contemporary problems of our time in evidence-based medicine. And so he's saying the status quo is not acceptable. So I said I would tell you a little bit about what's going on outside of the United States. The European Medicines Agency is not exactly the FDA, but you can think of it as an analog. In the EU, since November 2010, the European Medicines Agency has had what is the most, in my opinion, the most revolutionary, radical policy on access to data ever seen, which is one that says anything in our holdings, any document we have, including clinical trial data, is potentially available for anyone who asks for it. Anyone. And since November 2010, they have released 1.9 million pages of clinical trial data and other documents, regulatory documents. This is unprecedented. They're also contemplating right now a policy on the prospective publication of data, including that patient-level data. Okay. And I might add, because I think it's of relevance to this audience, that they are developing their policies in a completely open and deliberative fashion. Kay Dickerson, as well as myself and other people at Hopkins, we've been involved in their advisory committees that are trying to design what the prospective publication policy will be. And it's been open to anyone. I don't know if anybody, you don't have to be a researcher, anybody's there. Industries at the table, academia is at the table, healthcare organizations, patient organizations, they're all there. This gives you a little bit of sense of what kind of data is being released. So I'm part of a Cochrane systematic review group that's looking at the evidence on Tamiflu, influenza antiviral. And this is a clinical study report for one trial on the desk. It's 8,545 pages. Okay. Most of it is printouts of data, but about 500 pages is actually material that you would want to read through. How the study was done, what the protocol was, what the statistical analysis plan was. All of that information about the trial and what you need to know is compressed into a 7-page journal article. In this case, the journal article came out 10 years after the trial was completed. So the question is, put this in perspective, how can you know whether what's in the journal article, like the JAMA article, is accurate if you don't have access to the underlying data? So I think that not only one does this ensure that we can make sure that there's accuracy, but the idea that data will be available for every published article also puts a disincentive out for those publishing to publish misreported trials. So this is a few of the many actors involved, I think, in the contemporary debate on access to data. There's a project at Yale where Medtronic is giving data to Yale University, all of its data, not all, almost all of its data. GSK and Roche have put forward policies on public access or researcher access to data. The British Medical Journal is now only inviting for consideration clinical trials where the researchers agree that they will make available the individual patient data upon reasonable request. On the other side of this line are the companies AbbVie, which is formerly Abbott, and Intermune. They're there because they are suing the European Medicines Agency because a competitor company requested data for their clinical trials. And AbbVie and Intermune are arguing that their clinical trial data is commercial confidential information. And sadly, the interim judgment from the EU court has agreed to put an injunction on release of those data. These are some of the arguments you hear why we shouldn't share data. And industry has arguments you hear the most. Misleading analysis, people won't analyze this. They'll look for problems that really aren't problems. It will violate patient confidentiality, and these data are commercial confidential information. They're our property. Academics also don't readily share data for some different reasons. They want to publish more papers. This is a promotional career issue. It's too much work. They don't have any money in the grant left to figure out how to share the data, and they wouldn't know how to do it if they're asked. And some of these are legitimate because we are entering a new world of data sharing where people haven't shared data like these before. So there's a lot of things to be worked out. The important thing is to say, what is the goal, and are we moving towards it? So like I told you, EMA, the European Medicines Agency, is very involved. This is their homepage. And their homepage is directing people to their prospective policy on this topic. They're inviting comments. This is the policy, the document out now for comments, the forthcoming policy. They state, and this is, I think, the most clear-cut statement I've ever seen on this topic. Clinical trial, that's the CT, clinical trial data cannot be considered commercial confidential information. It's an unambiguous statement of their position. And this is the most amazing aspect in terms of the politics around data, the bottom one. That part of the reason we should have public access to data is that third parties can then use it to verify and challenge the regulatory authority's position where appropriate. Here's the FDA, on the other hand, what we have in a request for comment that's still active. They'll be releasing individual patient data such that one cannot determine the product they're looking at. I don't need to say any more. That is the specific goal of intention in this form of data release. So the good news is we have movement. You mentioned the New York Times. There was an editorial by the paper that followed the article on Tamiflu, and they're clearly, I think, on the right side of history here. Full disclosure needed for clinical drug data. The bad news, Big Pharma, this is something we just saw, Big Pharma is mobilizing patients in the battle over drug trial data. A leaked memo from Pharma two heads of the member organizations talked about a four-pronged strategy, one of which was colonizing patient advocacy groups to argue against what's going on in Europe with the EMA initiative. This is how some groups have reacted. The European AIDS Treatment Action Group has said very clearly they're not part of this plan and have encouraged people to sign petitions like the All Trials campaign, and that's where I'll end, to ensure that we do everything that we can to move towards greater transparency. So what can you do? all trials is a very simple campaign. It's a 4-sentence long petition written such that I don't think anybody in the audience would disagree to its goals. And Q has signed. Right? But your logo is not on the list of organizations, so you might want to get your logo up. Okay, I'll send a message. And here's, I'll leave on the screen while I sit down, because I'm over time. I made two little quick links to the documents, the draft policies. We have an FDA policy I showed you that's now accepting comments, and an EMA policy that's also accepting comments from anybody, individually, organizations. So let our voices be heard. Thank you.